Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Winward Academy's webinar about applying to college during coronavirus and positioning yourself for success. I'm Dr. Jennifer Winward, and I'm the founder and CEO of Winward Academy. I'm pleased to welcome you all today, and we'll go ahead and jump right in. There are two main goals for today's presentation. First, we'd like to address parents and teens' most burning questions about preparing for college during coronavirus. Second, we will provide specific tips to stay sane, get ahead, and position yourself for success. Here's an overview of the topics that we will discuss today. So we'll talk about letters of recommendation, ACT and SAT optional status and fall dates, gap year options, math learning gaps, tips for college essays, the importance of applications activity sections, and then finally tips for success this summer. So the way that I kind of put together all of these ideas of what we would discuss is I just kind of thought about all of the questions that parents have been asking and wanted to kind of do a good overview of each of those with you today. Now, one thing that is important to mention is I could probably spend at least an hour talking about each of these 7 items, but for today, we're really hoping to do more of a cursory overview of each area. And then based on interest and based on responses from all of you, we can certainly look to schedule more webinars so that we can dive more into the specifics of these topics. Given that I have a lot to cover, I might move more quickly through certain topics. So if I leave anything out or if you'd like me to expand in any area, then please submit a comment in the Q&A, and I will of course be sure to address it. Before we begin with our first topic, I want to quickly give a big shout out to Zoom. Winward Academy is excited to partner with Zoom, who is sponsoring our webinars so that we can reach larger audiences and so that we can educate families as they navigate this tough time. So thank you again to Zoom for being a part of today. All right, so here we go. My first recommendation to all of you is to not forget about the letters of recommendation. So given that students have been faced with these unprecedented challenges, there are components of an application like a letter of rec that are going to become more important and more impactful. So first, I want to make sure that you all remember that you're going to be getting letters of recommendation from your teachers, so likely at least one teacher, if not 2 teachers, and from your college counselor. So what does that mean, right? That means that you need to find ways to really stand out in this virtual teaching and learning environment. So I do have some specific ideas. Showing up on time, even in those virtual environments, is really important. Keeping your video turned on so that your teacher knows that you're engaged. Continuing to stay on top of your assignments, right? Turning them in early, being sure to turn them in on time, right? Making sure that you're not putting teachers in a position that they have to try to hunt you down. Coming prepared is really important. Asking intelligent questions, finding ways to contribute in those group discussions online, right? I promise you that your teachers are struggling to instruct you in a virtual environment, and when they say, hey, who has any questions about something, if you're the one who is jumping in and contributing, I promise you that your teacher really, really appreciates that. Right? So find ways, even though it might feel hard, there are ways that you can still stand out, even though we're in more of a virtual world. Also continue to reach out to your college counselor, right? Show your college counselor that you're on top of your research, you're on top of your applications, right? That you're really taking advantage of summer to get ahead. Right? So when you maintain that open communication and keep that line of communication going, it will really showcase that you're responsible and mature and on top of all of these important deadlines. Next, we'll talk about the ACT and the SAT. So first, I want to discuss with all of you, why are they optional, right? Why have colleges had to make that decision? So it's been a crazy time with cancellations, right? We have families, I know families in San Diego who are going to Vegas and Reno to take the ACT in July. I know families in New Jersey who are going to New Hampshire to be able to get an opportunity to take the test, right? These cancellations have caused a tremendous amount of stress for families and have really limited access to be able to take these exams. So colleges really had no choice. They had to make these tests optional, given these barriers that currently exist. So that brings up the question, right? Well, if I have scores and they're really strong, should I submit them? Or if I've been putting in a lot of work to take these tests, should I still, try to take them in the fall? Should I still keep going forward and plan to submit them? And the way that I'll answer that question is just by kind of getting a little bit deeper in what does it mean when things are really optional. So Harvard, for example, has an optional extra essay when you apply. So the question really becomes, if you're in a situation where you can write that extra optional essay, should you? And of course, the answer is yes, right? A lot of things in life might seem optional, but if you are in a situation in which you can do those optional items and you can do really well with them, you still want to do that, right? So that you can really showcase how competitive you are when you're applying. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you're in a situation where you absolutely cannot take these tests, they've all been canceled, there's no kind of easy way for you to access to be able to take them, then of course you'll be able to apply. You just won't have those scores as part of your application. So what's really important for you to know is that every single college application has a little extra section where it says, is there anything else you want us to know? So in that section, if you need to kind of explain why you don't have scores or why certain aspects of your application might not be as strong or might not be as developed, that is the place to be able to explain that. The next thing that I wanted to talk about that comes up a lot with discussion around ACT and SAT is the recent decision by the UC Regents about kind of phasing out the ACT and SAT as they phase in a new test. So the UC Regents recently conducted, the UC Academic Senate actually recently conducted a survey, basically tried to figure out what they wanted to do about the ACT and SAT. And they did decide that in the next 5 years, they're going to kind of phase out their requirements for ACT and SAT as they phase in a new test that the UC schools are actually going to develop. Now, I do want to make sure that you all know that this was a big announcement made by the outgoing UC president. Actually, yesterday, a new president was named, Dr. Michael Drake, who's going to be joining the UC schools coming from The Ohio State University. So a lot of this is still very much up in the air. We don't know how Dr. Drake is going to respond to these recent announcements, if he's going to continue through with that same vision that Janet Napolitano started. So again, this was a recent decision. We have a big change of leadership. We have a huge budget crisis, right? There are a lot of things up in the air that where we could and likely will see some changes when it comes to what the UC policies are going to be about ACT and SAT. So what I want to end with kind of on this slide about ACT and SAT is kind of if you are still in the mindset of wanting to take them as a rising senior, or if you're perhaps a younger student and you want to try to take advantage of this time to get ahead and make yourself more competitive by studying early, I want to just break down kind of what each grade level could be doing at this time, again, to really maximize your success on these tests. So if you're a rising 12th grader and you are looking to take the exam, maybe you're taking the ACT in July or the SAT in August and then, continuing into the fall, the most important thing for you to be doing this summer is taking time tests, so exposing yourself to past real exams, self-proctoring them with that time pressure, and then after you take a time practice test, giving yourself an opportunity to go over every single mistake that you made, so that for each one you understand what was the question asking, how do you solve it correctly, and then most importantly is this third step, think to yourself, why did I miss this question? Like you need to be able to fill in that answer. I missed this question because, and then explain to yourself why you missed it, right? That last step is where students really start to become more aware of their own thinking and their own learning, and that's where you really see huge gains. So again, avoid the I'm going to take 10 practice SATs before the real one and just kind of trying to test. That's not the best approach, right? It's definitely more important to have quality over quantity. Take practice tests, but give yourself that time in between each one to really learn and grow from your mistakes. For rising 11th graders, most important thing for them to do right now would be to take a diagnostic in an ACT or an SAT, or if you're trying to decide between the two tests, you can kind of figure out which one you score higher on. And then looking at the mistakes that you make in this diagnostic to create a study plan so that you can address those specific content gaps. So for example, if you take a practice ACT or a practice SAT, and you notice that you make a lot of mistakes in triangles, or you make a lot of mistakes in commas or something like that, then that's a signal to you of, hey, put in some time to make up those knowledge gaps in those areas. And again, as you're building that content knowledge, yes, it will help you on the ACT or SAT, but by the way, it's also just really important information for you to know for your lives. So again, recognizing these specific content gaps is going to be much easier when you take a diagnostic and can really dig into your mistakes. For rising 9th and 10th graders, really the most important thing that you can do right now is not necessarily kind of get too ahead of yourselves and get really stressed out about these tests, but instead just really focus on the content that you need to be successful on the test, but also successful in your lives, right? The ACT and SAT test you on specific knowledge of grammar rules, math equations, and being a strong reader. So if you can focus on developing those 3 areas of yourself, then it's of course going to help you on the ACT and SAT, but more importantly, it's really going to help you in your future. So again, just really making sure that you take advantage of opportunities to read, become a stronger reader, review math if maybe you feel like the end of last year, you know, that you got gypped a little bit and that you weren't able to really grow your math skills as much as you wanted to. It would be a great idea to, again, put in some time and to make up those learning gaps and make sure that you really learn those math concepts. And then, of course, just building grammar rules is really important to be a strong writer. The next thing that I want to show you are the dates. So ACT and SAT have both announced new dates in the fall, right? Because of all the cancellations, they're trying to create even more opportunities for students to take these tests. So ACT has added an additional test date in September and 2 additional dates in October. So you'll notice I put little stars next to the new test dates that were recently added. It's still a little bit gray, but ACT is working on an at-home virtual testing option. It's possible that it'll be ready by October. It's more likely it'll be ready by December, but this is something that they've been testing for the past several years in Asia. And now they're planning to bring that to the US so that students do have the option to take the exam on a computer, which then opens up the opportunity for them to take it from home. SAT originally announced that it was going to provide that same opportunity for students to have an at-home testing option. They recently scrapped that plan, presumably because it was a big lift for them to be able to deliver something like that. So what they did instead is they added a September test date. So that September 26th test date for the SAT is a new date. It's only for the SAT, not for subject tests. So I did kind of indicate that there on the slide. The other thing that the SAT mentioned as well, they're considering that if there is demand, they will add another exam in January. So I guess kind of the main takeaway from this slide is that ACT and SAT are doing what they can to preserve the exam integrity. They're doing what they can to make sure that students are safe when they take these tests. But at the end of the day, we're all, you know, still dealing with a lot of question marks about whether these tests that are scheduled are actually going to happen and how they're going to happen. One other thing that I do want to mention is that ACT is going to be opening up its registration for these fall tests in the last week of July. So as I'm explaining to parents, it's kind of like Coachella when it opens up and everybody's going to go on and the website might crash, right? There's going to be this huge flood of people trying to register their teens for these tests. So just be on top of it. The last week of July is when these testing administrations will open up. And you definitely want to be on top of it so that you get a good location, get one hopefully pretty close to home as well, so that you're not one of those people having to cross state lines to access these exams. The SAT tests are currently open for registration, so you don't need to wait to register for the SAT. It's only the ACT that is opening up registration in late July. One thing too to mention kind of as a final note about ACT, SAT is that colleges are being very flexible. So they're extending deadlines for when these tests have to be done. They're allowing students to submit official score reports after the deadlines, which again, this is unprecedented that they've ever been this flexible. And I think too, it's important to mention that colleges are going to be understanding that students might not have an opportunity to take the test more than once. Right? In the past, colleges have said to students, hey, if you take it twice, if you take it 3 times, tell us your scores, we'll consider your highest scores. They're recognizing that students don't necessarily have an opportunity to take the test multiple times. So again, just kind of going into this knowing that, hey, if it's something that you can do, if you're going to be able to do really well, and if you've put a lot of time into it, you definitely want to see it through, because it would be great to have a strong score. But again, if you're in a situation where it's just completely not possible for you, then please know that that's not going to hurt you, in the sense that you explained that it was just something that because of access issues, you weren't able to take it. Okay, next thing is about gap year options. So we've had a lot of recent announcements, right? USC, University of Southern California, announced that it's going to be all virtual in the fall, that there will be some students allowed to come on campus for lab classes, for research. Harvard really shook things up by announcing that all classes for 2020 through 2021, so basically fall and spring classes, are 100% virtual. What's interesting that Harvard is doing is that they're going to allow students to live on campus, but only select groups of students. So in the fall, they're going to allow freshman students to live on campus. Again, they will not attend class in a physical classroom. Everything is virtual. And then in the spring, they're going to allow seniors to live on campus. So it seems like they're trying to be creative with creating that initial freshman experience and being able to preserve that senior experience, again, just given all of the constraints. So a lot of families are reacting to this type of news by going, well, maybe we should just wait to start college, right? Maybe we should just take a gap year and then just start in 2021. So I bring this up because so many families have reached out to me about pursuing this option, and you have to be really, really careful, because what some colleges are doing, and you have to kind of understand where they're coming from, but if their entire freshman class changed its mind and said, hey, I'm going to take a gap year and start in a year, the colleges would be in a really tough position, right? They would have a whole year without receiving any of that income from tuition. And then how would they accept students the following year, right? So what a lot of colleges are doing, and I bring this up because you need to be really careful before you make a decision for your family about this, but a lot of them are making decisions that if you choose to change and instead of starting this fall, you ask for a gap year, that you can actually lose your acceptance. They are going to force you to reapply the next year, which is gigantic. The other announcement that's happened, that again, these things are in the fine print, so you need to be really careful, is that students can lose their financial aid if they choose to defer a year and take a gap year. So again, just make sure that you're really careful, that you fully explore the impact of switching to a gap year before you make that decision for your family. And again, no one is saying here that this is an easy decision, right? This is so hard for everybody. I just want to be sure to bring this up, because before you jump into a decision like switching to a gap year, please, please, please do the research on what the policy is for the college, because you could end up really creating a more difficult situation for your son or daughter if he or she then has to reapply. Another top question that I'm getting from families right now is about their concern about math. Right, so as a subject, it's the one that carries the most between years, right? So understandably, it's where teens and their parents are really concerned. So summer is a great time to address some of these math learning gaps, right? To kind of review math gaps that may have existed from the end of last year, and then also to get ahead for the fall. So what I put together on these next few slides, I've done an overview of the top 10 math lessons for each subject. And one thing too that I want to be sure to mention is that I am more than happy to share these slides with everybody who's attending today, so I can email them as a PDF after. So please don't feel like you have to write all of this down right now. I am more than happy, and I'm planning to share all of this with you. So for students in Algebra 1, the idea here is, again, if you're concerned about math gaps, maybe because you just finished Algebra 1 or you're planning to start Algebra 1 in the fall, here are those top 10 math concepts that are going to be the most important for you to master, again, to really build that confidence that you're likely looking for. Here's that same list except for geometry, right? So you'll notice that there's a lot of focus on circles and triangles and shapes and lines. Again, I'm going through this quickly, but we'll be sharing these slides. Here's the list for Algebra 2, right? You'll notice that some of these concepts are building, of course, on the instruction for Algebra 1, and others are new to the Algebra 2 course sequence. Last math course with the top 10 list is kind of pre-calculus trig, and these are going to be the most advanced math concepts. One thing that is important for you to note is that there are some Algebra 2 courses where they actually teach some of this trig at the end of Algebra 2, so it could be that some of this was planned to be taught at the end of this past spring. Other teachers actually wait and do all of this pre-calc information in a pre-calc class. So again, kind of depending on how your Algebra 2 teacher designed a course, you would have either been expected to learn this at the end of Algebra 2, or it would first be presented to you in pre-calculus. So the next thing that I want to do is talk about the college essay, right? So the college essay is very, very important because especially in a world of, growing uncertainty and areas of your application that might not be as fully developed, if you haven't been able to do your extracurriculars, if you weren't able to take the ACT or SAT, right? That's why I started by talking about the letter of recommendation, because it's something people might forget about, but having a really strong letter of rec could maybe give you an even extra bonus now, given again that there might be areas of the application where for all students, they won't have necessarily been as developed. So it's also important to know kind of for the college essay, the essays that you're writing, is how much of this is really, really important for you to share your story and to really connect with the admissions officer. So I'm going to just give a couple tips about the college essays. And again, if you're in the middle of writing these, it will feel very relevant. But if you're joining us and maybe your son or daughter is a little bit younger, it's still just really important to know this information. So the first thing I want you to think about is kind of pretend that you've created a university, right? So I've made Jennifer University or Winward University. So what would I be looking for in a student, right? Do I want someone who's a know-it-all? Do I want someone who's really eager to learn? Do I want someone who didn't invest that much time learning about my university? Or do I want someone who put in a considerable amount of effort understanding my university's values and really defining how this student sees himself or herself aligning with my university's values, right? So admissions officers are people. Please don't forget that, right? They are going to care more about your application when you care more about your application. So as much as possible, when you can kind of get into the mindset of an admissions officer and try to think about it from their perspective, I think it really helps students just better understand how they can put together their essays in a way that's very genuine and demonstrates genuine interest and really connects to the values of a university. Another tip is to share your essay with someone who's never met you. So the advice that I typically give to my students, which isn't as easy to do these days as cafes are closed, but I recommend that when they think that they have their final essay in hand, that they approach someone at Starbucks or a coffee shop and offer to get that person a tea or coffee in exchange for reading that person's college essay, right? And the idea behind that is that when a perfect stranger reads your essay, and by the way, an admissions officer is going to be a perfect stranger, so we're kind of trying to recreate that experience, is sometimes when you're writing an essay, because you know the whole story, or your parents know the whole story, or your teacher knows the whole story, we kind of tend to fill in some gaps that may exist in the story that we're telling. So when you can give your essay to a complete stranger, you can ask questions like, was there anything where you were confused? Is there anything that I left out? What do you think about me? Like, what type of person do you think I am? Right? So when you can start to dig a little bit more into the values that you're trying to articulate in your essays and the person you are and the person you're trying to portray yourself as, then getting a complete stranger's viewpoint is really helpful, because then you can really know if you've been successful in achieving those goals. Another tip for the college essay is to stay true to yourself. Okay, so the ultimate goal of the essay is to honor your voice and your story. Okay, so when you pick something that you really genuinely care about, your voice is going to come through. Your essay is going to be more engaging. It's going to be more memorable. So you want to think about telling a story that only you can tell, right? You want to give the reader a sense that he or she has met you. So maybe think first, like, how do you want to be remembered? You know, kind of do that internal processing or reflection, and then try to think about a powerful way that you can share your story that has a genuine tone where you're allowing yourself to be vulnerable, right? And this process can be very challenging. So it's important for you to know that you need to give yourself time to really allow yourself the reflection that's needed to honor your voice in the process of putting together this essay. Next, it's really important to trust yourself and to choose a topic that you're comfortable writing about. Excuse me. So anything forced or artificial is immediately obvious to the reader. And at the same time, sometimes you might be talking about difficult or controversial topics. And as long as you treat them with respect and maturity, it's okay to kind of explore some of those other areas. You can include humor. You just want to make sure that it's tasteful and respectful and not forced. There's always kind of a fine line there with including humor in college essays. One other really important point is that sometimes students feel like they're being genuine and they're being authentic when they complain about a teacher or when they offer ingratitudes about their school, because they might be sharing a story from their viewpoint. However, you need to be very, very careful that you do not come off as unappreciative, as cynical, as rude, as lazy, as self-interested, right? That is not the person that is going to be attractive to a college admissions officer. So again, if you choose to write about something where maybe deep down you really do feel like it's all your teacher's fault, again, you're allowed to have that opinion. But if you're choosing to write about that in your essay, try to shift the way that you write about it so that you're telling a story in a way that shows that you've grown from an experience, that you've learned what you've learned, and how you're going to take an experience and really grow from it and kind of continue to contribute and continue to grow. Another note about the college essays is to make sure that you emphasize the positive. So yes, your goal is absolutely to shine a bright, positive light on yourself, but when you can do so with humility, it really goes a long way. So you don't want to put others down or brag excessively to try to make yourself seem better, right? By the way, that's great advice just for everyday life, not just for a college essay. Focus on the story that you're telling, right? This is your story, and remember that no one else can dictate that story because it's really unique to you. So when you try to come up with what you want to write about, right, think about a moment in time that was really memorable to you, or think about something in your life that's a symbol of something with your family or something with a summer job or something that just was really, really meaningful to you that you can then develop to really kind of bring the reader in to get a sense of who you are and what makes you tick and what makes you intellectually curious, right? That's really the goal, is to be able to bring them in. And remember that you're not just explaining what you do, you're really sharing who you are. And I think that for a lot of students, when they can really see that important shift, it can really illuminate what areas they can talk about in their essays. Last thing about college essays, I want to highlight kind of the do's and the don'ts. So when it comes to the do's, right, making sure that you do these things, you want to give a complete picture of who you are. So when you have 4 essays to write for one college, they should not be one-dimensional. They shouldn't all be about the same thing, right? You aren't one-dimensional. There are multiple things that make you special. So you want to make sure that you're really highlighting all of those. Be super careful about following the word and the character limits. This is really, really important. And I actually, very interestingly, so this week I'm teaching a college application workshop. And a student yesterday asked, for the personal insight questions for the UCs, they give you 350 words. Is it okay if I just do 200 words? Or is that going to be really obvious that it's going to feel really short? Right, so kind of this discussion of word limits or character limits works in both directions. Of course, you can't go over because they're going to cut you off. But at the same time, to that student's great question from yesterday, you also want to be careful that if they give you 350 words, if you only write 200 words, you're really leaving 150 words on the table where you could more fully develop the story. So again, if it's 350 words, you don't have to be at 350. You could be at 329 or 333. But if what you write is really a lot different from kind of where they're setting that bar, you do want to be careful to make sure that you've really given them enough information to complete the story. Reading the essay out loud and slowly is super important. So a lot of times when we read in our heads, sometimes our eyes skip words as we're reading because we're able to see them in our peripheral vision. But when you read something on paper out loud, we're kind of forced to actually focus on each word, and it can definitely help reveal if you have little typos. So taking the time to read the essay out loud and slowly is going to really help you recognize if you have little things that you need to fix. Taking the time to really think about a strong opening that's going to have a great hook is definitely worth the investment. When you can, again, these people are human beings. We got to capture their attention so that they're willing to kind of keep reading our stories. And remember, these people who are reading your applications are going to get tired. They're going to be hungry. They're going to be cranky, right? They're humans. So as much as possible that you can recognize that the person reading your essay might have just had a big lunch, might be really tired, and oh, here we go, I got to start reading them again. Find a way to hook that person's attention, because again, we don't really know what situation the reader is going to be in. Also important to do a final read before submitting. What happens is students work on their applications for months and months, and then they just get so excited when they're done, they just want to click submit. Please, please, please just give yourself that extra 15, 20 minutes, and before you click submit, just do another really careful read all the way through to make sure that nothing weird or funky has happened in your application. Okay, so to the don'ts. So the first don't is to not repeat the activity section in your essay. So a common mistake that students make is that the activity section, they're describing what they do, and then in their essays, they basically just repeat information that was already stated. You don't want to do that. If you talk about content in the activity section and in the essay, that is okay. Just make sure you're not giving the same information. So what I tell my students all the time is the activity section should be more of the what you did, like giving a description of what you did, whereas the essays are really more of where you can explore why it was important or how you did it, or kind of more of that personal element to the activity. Don't skip part of the prompt. Students make this mistake all the time. If a prompt says, describe a creative talent and how you pursued it inside and outside the classroom, if all you do is talk about a creative talent that you do in class, you have not answered the prompt. Okay, you need to be very careful, read exactly what the prompt is asking, and make sure that you have very directly answered that question. Next don't is don't embellish. Okay, it's important to remember that when you're applying to college, you want to be accurate, you want to be honest about your activities, about your awards, about what you've done. So be very, very, very careful about exaggerating or misrepresenting what you've done, because again, it's just not worth it, and you never know if you're going to get caught in a lie. I'll give you one example of a student I heard of who put on her resume that she was fluent in Spanish. And when she showed up to her alumni interview, the person saw that on her application's resume and said, oh, you speak Spanish, and started speaking to her in Spanish. And she completely froze because guess what? She had embellished. I mean, she took Spanish at school, but she was not fluent, and she got completely caught in a lie. And I'm sure you can all imagine that she was not accepted. So be very, very careful with embellishing. Don't rely on a thesaurus. This is something that a lot of students do. They feel this pressure to use big words to impress the admissions people, and it's really not the best approach. I mean, you're sharing a story, and so you want it to sound like you, and I promise you that if you highlight a word, look up a thesaurus, and just replace it, it will be immediately obvious to the person reading your essay. So resist that temptation. I mean, if naturally you have a more opulent vocabulary, you can bring some of those words into your essay. Again, if it's natural for you and you're using the words correctly, that's okay. But resist the temptation to do the highlight, thesaurus, replace approach, because you could get caught using words incorrectly. Last don't for the college essays is don't rush the writing process, okay? It takes time. You will make so many revisions of your essays just wanting to make sure that every sentence and every word is really sharing something special about you. So give yourself that time, knowing that it really is a longer process to be able to perfect your essays. see. Oh, sorry, that stopped working. There we go. So next thing, I did talk a little bit about the activity section, but I want to say a few more things about it. Number one, do not neglect it. So a lot of students know about the essays and know that they have this big pressure to put together these personal insight questions for the UCs or the perfect personal statement for the Common App. And then they neglect the section of the application in which they're asked to describe their activities. You don't want to do that. The other reason, or the other thing to bring up, is that the way that the application is organized, they will look at your activity section before they read your essay. So when you're describing what you've done and awards that you've won and leadership and extracurriculars and work experience, I mean, you're kind of priming the person reading the application for the essay. So if I'm looking at an activity section that seems kind of skimpy, where it looks like the student didn't really put a lot of effort into describing the activity and highlighting the way that the student grew and contributed in unique ways, you know, again, I'm a human being reading this application, and I'm going to kind of get a little lukewarm to someone versus getting really excited about the person if I just am not perceiving that the person really put a lot of effort in there. So make sure that you don't neglect that activity section. You want to, when you describe the activities that you do, you want to demonstrate responsibility, demonstrate leadership, impact, and most importantly, genuine interest. Right? Somebody once said to me kind of this interesting concept of how when you're applying to college, you're kind of creating your personal brand, right? It's almost like creating a company, right? What are the values of the company? What are the colors and what are the symbols and like those types of things? It's odd to think about in that way, but there's a lot of truth to it, right? You're kind of saying, this is who I am. And a huge part of who you are is what you do and how you do it. And so the activity section really, really captures that, right? Because it's going to show ways that you've demonstrated leadership, that you've impacted the community, that you've had a genuine interest in something that you've really developed or a hobby that you love. So please do not neglect the activity section. Also important is don't use acronyms. A lot of students make an assumption that the person reading the application will know what certain things stand for, but you want to be very careful not to make those assumptions. Also, just as you would do on a resume, super important to use strong action verbs as you're describing your accomplishments and your contributions. So I have an example here to share. Let's say you're a student and at your high school, you meet potential new students and give them tours of the campus. You would not want to say help with tours. How can we describe your accomplishments and your contributions in a way that's more specific, right? So what do you do? Well, you represent your school by giving campus tours, providing information about the school's history, and answering questions about boarding life. Let's take it to the next level. Let's put more specifics about what you do. Because again, by describing the activity more, I'm learning something about you. I'm learning that the school trusts you to be a face of the school, right? That you're somebody who would be a role model for students, who would be enthusiastic about a school and its history. These are all really good qualities, right? So we want to make sure that they're definitely being highlighted. Okay, so last thing that I wanted to go over today, and then we'll get to your questions, are tips for success for this summer. So because a lot of activities have been totally canceled, right? Particularly sports or research opportunities, internships, right? A lot of families are really struggling to figure out, well, what in the world can we do from home that's safe, but is still developing really good skills for my teens? So I have some specific ideas to share. First, I think it's a great opportunity to practice public speaking and presentation skills. So maybe you could watch an educational documentary and then put together a PowerPoint presentation about what you learned and then present that to your family, or host a Zoom conference and present it to your friends, or maybe you even do it together, something like that. But public speaking is a skill that is often neglected in academic settings. So I think, it's a great opportunity to build that skill now. Refining writing skills for professional settings is also a great life skill that students could look to develop. So I'm having a lot of my students do this kind of pretend activity of applying to their dream job this summer. So they're researching the job, they're identifying what skills and personality traits that job seeks. And then I'm having them pretend to apply, write a cover letter. How will you highlight those skills and personality traits as you apply? Also thinking of ways that maybe this job is looking for skills that you don't currently have. So learning that is really the first step, of course, and then finding ways to pursue and develop those skills would be the second step. So if you find a job that prioritizes people who have graphic design skills, go find a class and learn about Adobe. Or if you have a job that wants people who have very basic coding experience, then you could look for an online class that provides that type of instruction. Another idea could be to understand financial planning, right? Learning what is debt and what is equity and how do you balance a checkbook, right? Maybe even you could set up a Quicken account for your teen to learn how to track expenses. Given that our April 15th deadline for taxes was extended to July 15th, it's also the perfect time to talk to your kids about taxes, right? How are they different in different states? How are they different in different countries? And what documents do you need to prepare taxes? Researching colleges is also a great way to use time this summer. So kind of creating a list of schools that you want to apply to, and then more importantly, identifying specific reasons why you like the colleges. So what is unique research being conducted there? What special courses are taught there? What visiting speakers do they host for symposiums? Ooh, this is another good one. What programs do they offer for undergraduates to be able to roll into master's programs? So they're usually called 3-2 programs, where you do 3 years for a bachelor's and 2 years for a master's. If you're a student who knows that you're likely going to want to get a master's degree, hey, if you can save yourself the time of taking the GRE or the GMAT and the expense of applying to a lot of graduate programs, it would be great to be accepted to a 3-2 program coming out of high school. But again, you need to do the research to see if that currently exists. You could also look for student organizations on a college campus that you would want to join, or maybe if there's a school you really like and it doesn't have a student organization, then you could found it, right? You could create it. Another idea for this summer is to enhance your reading skills. So what I always tell families, right, because sometimes it's hard to jumpstart your teens into a love of reading if it doesn't currently exist, would be to start with the topic. So find a topic that you love and then find 5 books about that topic. So ideally, again, this is like waving a magical wand. Ideally, teens should be reading 50 pages a day out of a book. And then what I say to students is, hey, if you're doing your reading, great. If you're looking for some extra credit that's purely intrinsically driven, write an essay about that topic, right? Pick a topic you love, read 5 books, write an essay about it, or back to that first tip about public speaking, put together a presentation about what you learned. Another idea would be to develop your intellectual curiosity. So a lot of colleges have essays about how are you intellectually curious. So it's kind of a fun question and even a great question to ask yourself before you're applying to college, right? Just great to know what does make you intellectually curious. So I have some students spending time this summer, they're learning the location of every country in the world, kind of focusing on one continent at a time, and then testing themselves by labeling a world map. Another great idea that's also fun and relevant for family is that you could learn your family's history. Maybe write a story about your grandparents' lives or something like that that maybe you've never really taken the time to learn more about. Another idea, of course, is to practice adulting, right? Looking for opportunities to build life skills. Those can be things like learning to tie a tie or memorizing your social security number, or it could be things like doing a great job with chores around the house, finding a home project that you could do as a family. Maybe it's building a deck, cleaning out closets to donate clothes, painting a room, right? Those types of things can feel really good and you can feel really accomplished when you can pull those together. Another idea too would be to write a handwritten card of appreciation or thanks to 5 people. And then of course, making sure that that note is free of typos, and then putting it in an envelope and figuring out, okay, where do I put the stamp and where do I put my address and where do I put the person's address to whom I'm sending the letter. So those are good, just kind of fun things that you could do as well. And speaking of fun, my last tip for summer is really to find ways to have fun. So that could be a virtual cooking class that you do, like a taco night or a pizza night with friends. We have this idea of like a home chopped challenge, right, from that TV show where you just pull together a bunch of random ingredients and find creative ways to make something, pulling them all together. I have some students who really love to bake, and they kind of spend a day each week baking and then bringing their baked goods to their neighbors. You could look for ways to create virtual clubs. So maybe it's a book club, an adventure club, an arts and crafts club, something like that. If you're outside, you could consider learning about the constellations, right? Kind of appreciating our night sky and maybe learning about how different cultures in the world have seen myths and seen legends in the stars. And could also be fun to do it-yourself projects, right? Building a table or painting or something like that. So again, having fun is going to be something that, you know, there are ways to have fun that still build skills, right? So again, as much as possible, I know everybody's very, very anxious about worrying about math and worrying about reading and worrying about college and worrying about test prep. And those are important things to worry about because there are really important life skills contained within each of those. And also content knowledge and confidence that of course comes with mastery of those. But as much as possible, you know, having fun as well is of course really important. So before we get to the Q&A, I just have two quick announcements. Our next webinar, which is going to be 3 weeks from today, is kind of to focus on helping families brace for an uncertain fall semester. So we're going to be doing a Q&A format with Dr. Valerie Rock. She has over 20 years of clinical experience in the field of psychology, and she specializes in working with adolescents to help them manage their anxiety. So with all of the anxiety and all of the uncertainty for fall, we're really, really excited to host Dr. Rock and to be able to ask her questions about how families and how teens can really manage this experience. So one quick note is if you have any questions that you would want us to ask Dr. Rock, you can also email those to me in advance because she and I are going to be working together to put that together. The other thing too that I wanted to mention that's exciting is that we do have a special offer. So for the first 5 families who sign up for ACT, SAT, summer math, or our college application programs, I am going to do a free virtual consultation with those families as well. So please feel free to check those out if that's something that would be helpful for your family, and I'd be excited to connect with you and answer your personal questions. And then lastly, since we've gotten through the main presentation, I do want to go to all of your questions. One thing too that I want to note is that we do have about 15 minutes left till 3. I am happy to stay on longer. So of course you can, you know, leave or stay, but I do want to make sure you know that I do want to make sure that I can get to all of your questions. So we'll go ahead and start with that. I had one dad who was very on top of things and emailed me yesterday with a couple questions. So I'm going to start with these that he asked, and then I'll go ahead and go to the Q&A. So his first question was about what happens if you take the ACT or the SAT as a sophomore, but then now everything in junior year was canceled, right? So the only score that a student has is from sophomore year. Are colleges going to consider those scores? And the answer is, of course, yes. So when you apply to college and you put your ACT or SAT scores in, you actually give the month and the year when you took the test. So they will be able to see if the test was taken a couple years ago. They will then, of course, know that the test was taken when the student was younger. So yes, you should absolutely submit those scores. And if you are a student who then in the fall as a senior doesn't end up with an opportunity, like what happens if every single test in the fall is canceled, right? I mean, that's a possibility. And so if that happened, then yes, of course, the schools would consider the score from sophomore year. And yes, of course, they would also be considerate that, you know, likely if you were to retake it later, you would have seen growth given that you took it for the first time as a sophomore. The next question is about if the tests are being offered online, do you recommend taking the tests? So I mentioned earlier about how ACT is kind of shifting to a virtual testing environment where they're going to allow people to take it on the computer. So one thing that's really important to note is before you sign up to do that route is just know that it is a different experience taking a test on a computer. So think about something like a math question, right? If you see it on a computer screen, but in order to solve the question, you need to kind of label it or draw on it. You do lose a little bit of time as you copy what you see on the screen onto a piece of paper. So yes, if you feel like you can practice in that environment of getting access to practice tests that are online, and then you can kind of work those examples and go through it so that you know what the experience will be like, it's definitely something that you can take advantage of. Okay, so those were the 2 questions submitted yesterday. Let me go ahead and go to the Q&A here. Okay. ACT, SAT optional. If my kid is a rising junior, how will they run tests since March and June tests were canceled? So for ACT and SAT being optional, if you have a son or daughter who's a rising junior, I mean, clearly that student is going to have a lot more opportunities to take the test beyond just this coming fall. What I am just giving a quick note to all juniors who will be juniors in the fall is that if you register for a fall test, and then let's say on that same day at that same site, there are also seniors who have registered. If something happens where the testing site needs to downsize because they can only accommodate fewer students, please know that the juniors are going to be the ones who are going to get cut. So there are a lot of families right now who have rising juniors who are on top of it, and they want to get this test out of the way in the fall. And I love that. And in normal circumstances, that's amazing. But do please know that you can be on top of it and you can register in advance. But if there are cancellations within a site, they are going to get rid of the juniors first. We have another question. If when taking the SAT, say you get a low score, should you still submit the score? So that's a great question. I think it's important to recognize that if you take the test and you're going for it and you feel prepared and you don't feel like your score is an accurate reflection of how you would perform in college, remember that there's that extra essay in every application about, is there anything else we should know about you? That's a great place where students can have the opportunity to share, this is how I scored on the SAT. This is how I was doing on the practice. This is what happened to me during the test and how I feel like it's not an accurate reflection of my abilities. So you can certainly share the score, but you do want to make sure that you maybe address why you feel like the score is not where it should have been, for you to be kind of more in that mix of hitting the numbers of the students they typically accept. Another question is about the subject test. So I'm so glad that someone asked about that. So when you apply, right, you kind of have the ACT, SAT, which are those 4-hour tests about English skills, math skills, and reading skills. And then College Board, which is the company that makes the SAT, also makes subject tests. So the subject tests are different because they're 1 hour each, and they go over specific subjects like US history, world history, chemistry, bio, physics, right? They're in a specific subject and they're 1 hour each. So there are a lot of colleges that have SAT subject tests as being optional but highly recommended. Now, given that students have struggled to even take the SAT, for rising seniors right now, if you can only take the SAT, but then you don't have an opportunity to take subject tests, again, colleges will be very understanding. Because the way things currently stand is that for rising juniors, rising sophomores, rising freshmen, all of these kind of policies are currently planned to be put back in place for when you apply. So subject tests can be a great way to enhance a college application. So the subject tests are important, especially if you're applying to specific programs like pre-med or engineering. You have to check the requirements of those colleges really carefully, because oftentimes they'll require you have to do a math subject test, you have to do a science subject test. And sometimes they'll even be more specific, like you have to take a math level 2 and you have to do chemistry, or you have to do physics. I mean, sometimes they're even that specific about their requirements. So if you're in a position where you're a rising junior, rising sophomore, rising freshman, it is good to know about these subject tests. Interestingly, the past 5-10 years, colleges have kind of been placing less pressure on the subject test. Let's say they've kind of been moving more towards ACT, SAT being required and the subject test being optional and highly recommended. But that being said, if you're taking a full, course load of advanced courses, those are the courses that really prepare you well for the subject test. So it is good to plan ahead for that. Also, an important note is that if you're planning to take the SAT and the SAT subject tests, You cannot do that on the same day, right? So if you're planning ahead, let's say for junior year, and you think, okay, in May, I'm going to take the SAT and the SAT subject tests, you can't do that. You have to choose either subject test or the SAT on one day that the tests are administered. So it's important to plan ahead as you kind of look to the end of your junior year, or the end of your sophomore year if you need subject tests. Next question, do we know how they will administer the test? Face masks, 6 feet apart. Yes, all of the schools and all of the testing sites are being required to follow CDC guidelines. So whatever those guidelines are basically what these testing centers are trying to preserve at the testing site. And that's also why we've seen that some of them have had to cut students who have been able to access the exams, because if they need to space out the desks and they have fewer desks, then they can't accommodate the same amount of people. Okay, next question. My daughter is a soccer player. They just announced her fall season is canceled. It's her senior year. Should I encourage her to find a new extracurricular to fill up her activity section of her resume, or will colleges take this situation into consideration? The colleges will absolutely take this into consideration, right? They know that if a season is canceled, that, a soccer player isn't going to be able to pursue those, to continue to pursue that activity. So what I would say that your daughter can maybe think about doing is finding other ways to continue to nurture her talents with soccer. I mean, even if it's something she's doing in the backyard or something with a younger sibling, teaching maybe a sibling how to play. I mean, if there are ways to continue to nurture a talent that's really been with you for a long time, I think it's important to find ways to explore that. But yes, please know that colleges totally understand what's going on. It is not going to hurt your daughter if she can't play soccer because the season's canceled. So yeah, please know that. And please just help, your daughter know that as well, because I'm sure that she's feeling really stressed about that too. Okay, so the next question is, I'm in 11th grade and I want to do a quick time check. So we're getting close to 3. I am just going to continue to go through these questions. So please feel free to stay with us if you want to continue to go through the Q&A. I just don't want to feel like I'm cutting anybody off. If I'm in 11th grade, should I take the test now? Would that be a diagnostic or a practice test, or is there a place where I can find practice tests online? That's a great question. So if you're kind of in that rising 11th grade or maybe even rising 10th grade and you just want to expose yourself to a diagnostic, one great idea, you can actually create a free trial on Winward Academy. So we have unique partnerships both with ACT and College Board. So you can access real past tests. You can self-proctor them, you can score them through the platform, and then every question is broken down by lesson and topic. So you can actually view an analysis that will show you your percentage accuracy in every single area. And you can access step-by-step explanations for every single question. So a great way to start absolutely is to do a diagnostic. And then again, to kind of go through that process of learning from your mistakes, and then kind of recognizing the areas where you might have some learning gaps. Okay, I'm going to keep scrolling down here. Pomona College just announced that students will not be coming back to campus in the fall. What's your frank assessment of whether a freshman should start an experience without being on campus? While the risk of losing the seat is real, what about the downside of not getting the benefit of the overall experience? Okay, so I think that this question is probably a huge burning one for so many parents of teens who got gypped out of their last semester of high school and now are really facing this tough time in the fall. I mean, I think, to be honest, it's definitely going to be an individual decision for each family. Missing out on the freshman experience is huge, right? I mean, it's something that I still remember as an adult being a freshman and having your freshman roommate and kind of being part of exploring yourself and your campus and your activities. I mean, it's a huge part of just developing and maturing. So if you kind of see that the pros of that outweigh the cons of potentially having to reapply and then potentially losing your spot at Pomona, right? I mean, clearly your, I don't know if you said son or daughter, but worked really hard to get into Pomona, right? So there's definitely that trade-off of saying, hey, we're going to take a gap year and wait so that my son or daughter can have that freshman experience. There are a lot of families who are making that decision because they do really think that that on-campus experience is so critical. And so again, I just want to make sure that when you're making those decisions as a family, just make sure that you're also considering how you would then have to reapply if the colleges are forcing you to do that, because that will be time consuming and expensive, etc. My daughter is an upcoming senior and has not been able to take the ACT yet due to cancellations. Is the student allowed, or is it recommended to register for multiple test dates at the time in July so she has multiple scores? Great question. Yes, you can. So once it opens up, you could register for a September and an October test date. There are also going to be test dates later, like into December, which again, no senior really wants to think about continuing to have to take these tests into December, but that is an option as well. And colleges are being flexible with allowing people to submit scores after the deadlines. Do you think admissions will be more difficult this coming year for seniors, given that they'll be competing not just with fellow seniors, but members of this year's graduating class who are going to take a gap year? Any advice on this? Yeah, this is a really, really good question. And I think it just kind of gets back to, the tough decision of if you choose not to go and you choose to reapply, what is that going to look like, right? And we have no idea right now, the students who are going to choose to reapply, it's possible that the strongest students they admitted are going to be the ones to take a gap year because they're more confident that when they reapply, they'll be able to get in. It's also possible that maybe the students who thought that they really lucked out by getting into a school, like maybe they applied to a reach school and they got into it, and so they're too nervous to potentially risk not being readmitted. So my gut would be that the students who are more likely to say, hey, I'm going to take a gap year, I'll just reapply, are likely really strong students, right? Because they're going to be very confident that they're going to be able to either be reaccepted or that they're going to be accepted elsewhere. To be honest, I haven't really thought about that question until this very moment of you asking it. So I hope that my answer was complete enough, but I will continue to think about that too. And when we put together the notes that we send to all the families after each webinar, if I can think of some other points for that, I'll definitely share them. Let me see what other questions we have. Best places or services that offer test taking over the summer. Is it all online? Are there books to order? So ACT and SAT both have, prep books that have passed real exams. They're usually around $30 each, and you can get them on Amazon. They're both great resources. Again, you want to make sure that any practice you're doing, that it is real past tests, right? You do not want to take made-up tests. Made-up tests by prep companies can be made to be artificially easier or artificially harder, depending on whether they want to give you a diagnostic that's artificially harder so that your scores look lower. And then a lot of them have an unscrupulous practice of giving a end test that's made to be artificially easier so that it looks like scores grew. It's super wrong, super unconscionable. So the way to get around that is to make sure that any practice test you're doing is always a real past test. And it takes a lot to be able to provide that to families. Like it took us 4 months working with ACT's legal team. It took a year and a half working with College Board for us to get permission to give students real tests. I mean, it's like gold when you can get a real test, because it's going to really give you that accurate experience. And then also the scale for the scoring that was used is going to be the same. So you'll actually be able to get a really accurate sense of how you would score. Any advice on strategies for how to spend time during a gap year, whether that's volunteering, taking community college courses? I think those are both great ideas. I think depending on what happens in the fall and what is open, what isn't open, I mean, I think that, to be able to take time to give back to the community, to support the family, I mean, those are going to be great ways for young people to develop and grow. So I think that, exploring those different ideas will be really, really good. Another question, the LA Times is reporting today that LA County's top health official may not allow K-12 schools to reopen. I'm worried about my son falling behind with all this remote learning, especially in math, which is harder for him. As a parent, how can I fill in the gaps? Yeah, so that question being asked is definitely on every parent's mind, right? That there's a lot of concern of, what was my kid even learning in school? You know, now that I can really see that as a parent, I'm recognizing all of these gaps, and I'm concerned that, you know, I really need to step in as a parent and help fill in these gaps. So what I would say is really important is definitely to lean on, you know, professional companies that develop online curriculum, because it's a very time-consuming process to do it right. And when you can identify those resources, it can really, really help, again, to kind of fill in those gaps, because you as a parent might try to help your child and go, oh, well, I don't remember the last time I found the area of a triangle. And that's okay, right? But then to be able to have a resource that you can rely on where we can fill in those gaps for you of, here's a lesson on triangle basics and area, then it's something that you can kind of do together and explore and learn together. Let's see, a question came in. I recognize that I'm not fluent in piano. I didn't perform as much as I did, and I need to drop it from my resume. For my resume, should I drop piano because it's not competitive? So what I would say about kind of what you include on your resume or your activity section is that the most important thing is that you display genuine interest. So if you play piano every single day, if you taught yourself how to play piano, watching YouTube videos, and it's just something you love, you should absolutely showcase that. It doesn't matter if you didn't compete or if you didn't perform. I mean, this is still something that's a part of who you are, and it's a talent that you have. So you can absolutely still showcase your skills, even if it's not something where you compete, or even if it's not something where you perform. So again, you know, sometimes even thinking about just hobbies or things that you enjoy are good things that you can include in your activity section. Ooh, next question is really good. On the college application under the activity section, how far back should you go? Is it just for high school years? Ooh, and this person who asked the question uses semicolon correctly between two complete sentences. I love that. Most of the time when you are highlighting on the college application, you want to focus your activities to just high school. The only place where you really see questions about 7th and 8th grade is on the University of California application. They'll ask you about courses that you took, maybe like Spanish 1 or Spanish 2 or algebra or integrated math 1 or something like that. When you've taken some of those courses in 7th and 8th grade, they do ask about that. But when it comes to highlighting your accomplishments and your activities, you definitely want to focus that around high school. Integrated math. Oh yeah, what is integrated math? So integrated math 1, 2, and 3 is basically a blended version of algebra and geometry. So if you have a student in integrated math and you kind of want that same list of what are the top 10 for integrated math 1, the top 10 for integrated math 2, top 10 for integrated math 3, I'm happy to provide those as well. It's just kind of an integrated, as it's called, a way that they pull together algebra and geometry together into the course instead of separating them. I can imagine many essays will be written with the effect of coronavirus in mind. I feel that the essay experience will be different this year. I absolutely agree with you. As much as possible, I'm trying to dissuade my students from just writing essays about what I did during COVID-19 school closures, because I worry again about the admissions officers just feeling like, oh my gosh, I've heard this story before, I've heard this story before. So, as much as possible, right, you're trying to think of unique things to share that are really just you and your voice and your story. So while you might identify something that happened during coronavirus that you do want to share, that's okay. I just would caution people against the theme over and over and over again of, here was my life during coronavirus, here's my life during coronavirus. So while many essays are going to feel like they need to address changes in their record, like, oh, I stopped playing soccer and those types of things that were certainly affected, I still think it's really important for students to view the college essays as that opportunity for their voice, where again, you can share your voice and you can share a part of who you are, and it has nothing to do with coronavirus. So still kind of trying to channel and identify, what are my values? How do I want to, kind of present myself to colleges, is something that you can do and still keep separated from coronavirus. Yes, next question is about how schools are enduring huge financial losses due to COVID, right? Loss of income from sports. How do we assess if some of the smaller schools will remain solvent throughout my students' four-year experience? This is such a good question. And it breaks my heart, right, to even think about how so many of the smaller schools are struggling so much more financially, right? They don't have as big of endowments that they can lean on. They don't have the big sports to try to generate revenue for the campuses. And so many of those smaller schools are the ones that really focus on teacher-student interactions, on developing students' exploration of classical literature and writing and reading. Like, so many of those smaller schools really, really nurture those talents. And it's understandable why parents would feel like, what if I send my kid to a college and then the college goes bankrupt and it closes? I mean, that, I can't even believe we're having this conversation, to be honest, because it's so hard to even imagine. But I think it is still a really important question. And as uncomfortable as it might feel, right? I mean, I think that having those conversations with the colleges and reaching out to their admissions offices and asking some of those tougher questions about, you know, what is your plan to recover from this financially? I'm concerned about sending my son or daughter there, and then having, and by the way, I would have these conversations either anonymously. I wouldn't identify exactly who you are if you still have a child applying, just in case. Oh, sorry, I just saw, can you turn the screen share off? Sorry, I should have recognized that earlier. So anyway, I think that is a really good question. And I think that, you know, those types of conversations are going to start to become more in the front of people's minds as they cope with the reality of the impact of so much of what's happened with COVID. So for that person who asked that great question, I would say, you know, maybe stay tuned, because hopefully some of the public dialogue and conversations are going to start to focus on that question. And then we're going to just be able to learn more about how those smaller schools are going to remain solvent. Next question, what are certain writing topics that are overdone in college essays? So the absolute number one most trite, overused college essay is the one, you know, I didn't appreciate what I have until I built a house for a family in need, or like something like that, where it just feels like students, you know, have some experience where they build a house for one day and now all of a sudden they appreciate what they have. I don't want to downplay that experience, because I think that that's wonderful that teens commit themselves to that and, you know, are involved in their communities, but it is so overused that you want to be really careful about those types of topics. And I mean, just to give you some examples, like I had one student's college essay, he wrote about how he perfected the recipe for pickles. I mean, he literally told the story as he was in the kitchen, like testing different things and how he created the perfect pickle. And he was accepted at every Ivy League school where he applied, right? And his essay was just quirky and different and had nothing to do with a topic that likely anybody else would have ever written, right? So much of the conversations that we have with students to help them understand what to write about is to help them take a step back. You know, so many students feel this pressure of, I have to cure cancer or I'm never going to get into college, right? I mean, that's just not the case. Like, the colleges just want to know who you are. They know that you're a teenager, right? That you're still developing as a person. You're still exploring your identity. You're still figuring out your values. You're still figuring out what gets you excited mentally, you know, that you're learning in school. And so as much as possible, just kind of being personal and sharing a piece of yourself is what really impacts the admissions officers. But I would say definitely stay away from the, you know, I didn't appreciate what I have until I built a house for a family in need. Those types of topics are very trite. Next question, what do you consider a strong enough SAT score to be submitted? So sure, it depends on the university, but what would you say minimums? So in general, when you're applying, you'll want to do research. You can actually do this through College Board's website, where you can search for universities by name, and then you can view their median scores, where you can kind of see, usually what they display is kind of the middle 50% of students. What is their score range? As much as possible, you want to be, you know, in that range, or hopefully even higher. What I will say to keep in mind though is that when you look at that number, right? So let's say I go to a website, or I learned about a college and it says that, the range for the middle 50% of students was a 29 to a 32 on the ACT. Remember that that means that 25% of students they admit, so 1 out of every 4 students they admit has under a 29 on the ACT. So again, when you're looking at those numbers, it's important to remember that you are more than a test score. I mean, do you want to do well on these tests? Yes. For me, I want students to do well on these tests so that they actually learn the content and they can remember it forever. But when it comes to, scores and how important scores are for being competitive and for earning scholarships and stuff like that, you definitely want to look at the different universities and kind of what those numbers are that they're publishing, and then just make sure that you are, in that range or hopefully higher. But again, if you're lower, that doesn't mean you shouldn't apply. It just means you apply knowing that you might not be kind of in the same level as the rest of the people in the pack, but there could be other aspects of your application from your activities or from your personal statement that really, really help you shine. So you should still absolutely go for it, especially if you know a lot about the school and you really feel like it would be a great place for you. Next question is, I was scheduled for the SAT. It was canceled the day before. How do I go about rescheduling? I've emailed them because I've been charged again. Uh-oh, that's not good. I'm also a senior, so I wanted to take my SAT as soon as possible. So this is a great question. First of all, I'm so sorry to hear the College Board double charged you and didn't refund you when they canceled your test. So you're definitely going to have to, unfortunately, just deal with the phones of trying to call them. I mean, they're just the worst at answering the phone right now. Nobody can get through. But I do promise you that when you do get through, they will process a refund because they have to. But what you do want to do, especially if you're anxious to take it as soon as possible, is, get yourself registered for the August SAT, because that's going to be the earliest one. They did add a test in September, so you could also look at taking the one in September. And then the SAT is also offered in October, November, and December. So they're definitely loading up where they're going to have a test every single month. The next question kind of repeats something we talked about earlier. Do I know what's going to happen if the August SAT gets canceled? Yeah, I mean, if the August SAT gets canceled, it's going to be the same situation. Okay, let's try to move things to September. They might try to create another test date. I mean, everything right now is just so up in the air. So what I would do is, we'll be hopeful that the August test is going to be able to happen. So if you're studying for it, of course you want to stay on top of it. But, unfortunately, our current reality is that it's possible that the test won't happen. Given current college leniency, is SAT, essay less important now or not necessary? So this is actually a really good question. So there's been all of this research about what aspect of, a test score or something like that is most predictive of success in college. And interestingly, the aspect of a test score that is most predictive of success in college is a writing score. That's why a lot of colleges now will ask students to actually submit an essay that they turned in at school, because colleges are very interested in students' writing abilities. That being said, if you're applying to a school where they've, relaxed their requirements, if you're going to show up and take the SAT and it doesn't create a financial burden for you to also take it with the writing, then you should absolutely do that, because, again, it will only help you if you take it and have a really strong score. There are a lot of colleges, though, that don't require the writing section. They don't require it. On the ACT, it's called writing. On the SAT, it's called the essay. So again, it's just kind of weird because they're talking about the same thing but use a different word. So definitely do your research. If you're applying to schools that typically like to see the essay, then you would want to provide one. If you're applying to schools that really don't look at the essay, then you could, of course, skip it. Do you think colleges will admit more students because of virtual classes increasing? Yeah, this is a really, really good question. We have no idea what's going to happen in the fall. I mean, I'm sure people are anticipating that the virtual world is going to change and hopefully go back to in-person classes. And so, for future classes applying, this virtual space wouldn't hopefully apply. What I'm personally kind of curious about is whether some colleges are going to, after they put all of these policies into place or kind of ways to support digital learning, I'm curious if they might end up accepting students for in-person, living on campus experience, and then also accept students for a virtual experience. Like, we're going to have to see what happens over the next year if colleges kind of start to have two types of students they accept. But in terms of affecting admission standards, I certainly think, colleges have spent hundreds of years establishing themselves as being, the top 10 or the top 25, and they don't want that to change. So even regardless of everything going on with coronavirus, colleges are so aware of how they're perceived, and actually the number that colleges most compete with each other on is what % of students who are admitted actually go. So Harvard and Stanford are always kind of competing for that spot. It's usually around 85% of students who are admitted actually end up going to the school. So colleges, they're not going to want their reputations to change because of this. So I would say that I think that the admission standards are going to still stay pretty high. If a student, and I know I'm going completely over, but I just want to continue going through these questions. So again, feel free to stay with us, or if you have to hop off, we are also going to share the video on YouTube, so you could always kind of load it there and advance to the end if you want to catch what happens. If a student does not play sports, what activities could be used for the essay section, and will this be viewed less favorably? This is a great question, George. There are a ton of students who don't play sports. That's okay. You don't have to be an athlete to apply to college or to be attracted to a college. So whatever activities you do, right, whatever hobbies you do, summer jobs, or things that you do for your family, things that you do at school, ways that you're, involved there, that you've pursued leadership opportunities. You can absolutely highlight all of that in an essay. You do not have to write about sports in a college essay. You can really explore any of those other topics. Right, I even just mentioned the student whose college essay was about perfecting a recipe for pickles, right? That has nothing to do with sports, but it was still very charming and funny, and kind of drew you into his story in a way that was very clever and creative. So please don't feel like just because you don't play sports that you're not going to have something wonderful to write about yourself. Next question, when should seniors start submitting their scores if they have not taken their SAT or ACT yet? Also, what would you recommend taking over the other if you only have time for one? I'm going to answer your second question first. If you only have time for one test, which makes sense because right now obviously things are really crazy, right now you should take a practice ACT, take a practice SAT, not on back-to-back days because I don't want you to be tired when you take the second one, but take a full-length practice test of each so then you can compare your scores and see where you perform better. That's going to help you decide which test to take. Then your next question is about when should you submit scores. So what colleges are doing is that they're being much more relaxed about when you take them and when you submit them. So let's say, for example, that you take the October ACT test, but you still want to apply early somewhere, which has a November 1st deadline. The colleges are going to be very understanding that it's going to take time for you to get your score. First, you'll email the admissions office and self-report it. So the second you get it in your account, you want to let the college know how you did by sending an email to admissions. Then you would order your official score report, which can still take 1 to 2 weeks to arrive at the college. But again, they're being super understanding with this. So if you feel stressed about missing deadlines and that type of thing, I would remove that pressure because again, the colleges are going to be really understanding. Okay, next question. Looking at the President of the United States stand on international students' admission into colleges, wish to understand your views. So just so that kind of everybody's aware of what this question is asking. So I think yesterday or the day before there was an announcement that, part of the US's policy is that if you are a purely online student, that you cannot get a visa to live in the US. So because colleges are kind of shifting to potentially be all online, there's now this kind of swirling controversy about whether those international students should be able to get visas to live in America if they're attending a college online. So Harvard and MIT have reacted to that decision. They're basically suing the Trump administration to say, hey, you know, this isn't fair. If we have international students, we still want them to be able to get visas, even if we're teaching online. So to get to your question, I mean, this is so new. It's just been the past day or two that all of this has kind of come about. So I think it's probably too early to know kind of what the ultimate decision is going to be. So I think we're just going to have to give it a little bit of time to see how things unfold and see kind of how the college's policies and the federal government's policies are going to either align or disagree, and then how that unfolds into, you know, admissions decisions. Okay, we've got 2 more questions. Thanks for answering the question about SAT scores. So for someone who couldn't take their final SAT in senior year, supposing that they get canceled again, would it be acceptable, perhaps even strong, if they submit a score for junior year that might be kind of below that 25th percentile? That's a really, really good question. I think that if you have a score that maybe you took for the first time in junior year, that you worked hard, you plan to retake it, you saw growth in your practice, and then boom, you have this horrible experience that your test gets canceled, I think that's something that you can share with the colleges that they would definitely understand. So if you submit a score that might be kind of right at that cusp that puts you at that, you know, 25% mark, to share the score, but then to communicate to the colleges again in that little, is there anything else we need to know essay, what happened and how you had studied and were planning to retake it and that it was canceled, I think you should absolutely still do that. The next question is about, when do I think the online SAT is going to be available? So the online SAT, that's a good question. So the College Board kind of rapidly adapted to be able to do AP tests online. They shortened the tests and kind of were able to pull that together really quickly. They were originally planning to have it ready by fall. And then they recently announced in the past couple of weeks that they're like, we're not going to be able to do this. And they're pushing it to 2021. So again, it's a great question, and I wish I knew exactly when, but as we've all seen in these past few months, people make decisions and then everything changes. So I would say it's much more likely that an online SAT would likely be available starting in 2021, kind of similar maybe to where ACT is going to do it. ACT, though, is way ahead of SAT in terms of being able to offer an online test. And again, too, I mean, they've actually adapted where now the GMAT and the GRE and stuff like that, they're letting people take from home. And I had a student who took it, and it's kind of this weird experience because there's a person watching you when you have your camera on. And I think at one point when he was taking his test, he kind of did this and was thinking and kind of covered his mouth. And all of a sudden this voice came through the computer and it was like, don't cover your mouth, right? So it's weird. I mean, when you're taking this in a virtual environment, someone is still watching you. So people are going to have to shift their mentality to kind of get over that, because it is definitely going to be a weird and different experience. Oh my gosh. Okay, so we got through your questions. I know that we went over by 30 minutes, but I loved all of your questions. I so appreciate that you joined us today. Again, if you have any questions, you can definitely go to winwardacademy.com. We have a wealth of resources there. We have a blog where we have tons of answers to these types of questions. And then if you wanted to ask me any questions personally, I know that my email address was in all of the Zoom confirmations, but I'll just give it to you again. It's jennifer@winwardacademy.com. So again, if you have any questions of things that came up today or other burning questions, please feel free to reach out. We will be sending everyone who attended today a little summary of the notes of the key takeaways. I have a feeling it's going to take me a long time to put together those notes because we just went over so many great questions. So I'll be sure to prioritize that and get that out to you. And then also, of course, you would then have my email, and I'll be sharing the slides as well. So thank you again for joining us. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, and hopefully we'll see you in a couple weeks with Dr. Rock. Thank you so much, everyone.